Ever since Amazing Fantasy 15 hit shelves back in 1962, Spider-Man has been one of the most popular and endearing superheroes of all time. Arguably the face of Marvel Comics, Peter Parker's trials and tribulations have enamoured readers for almost 60 years, as the friendly neighbourhood everyman attempts to fight crime and save the world, all whilst keeping his normal life together. This relatability aspect is one of the reasons why Spidey has always connected with audiences so well. His stories have always been grounded in very real and normal problems, even when the villains themselves are incredibly fantastical. Spider-Man has always been the everyman superhero, and I don't think this notion has ever been demonstrated better than in Chip Zdarsky and Mark Bagley's 2019 miniseries, Spider-Man Life Story. In case you're unfamiliar, Spider-Man Life Story is a 6-issue comic book that follows the life of Peter Parker in real time, beginning with his first appearance back in 1962 and following the wall crawler all the way up to the present day, reimagining the world of Marvel as if it evolved with Peter's decades of heroism. Life Story serves as an ultimate celebration of the things that make Spider-Man such a beloved hero. So in this video, I want to talk about how Zdarsky manages to tell such an incredible story, how the comic pays respect and homage to the incredible Spider-Man stories that came before it, and how Spider-Man Life Story ultimately tells a perfect love letter to the friendly neighbourhood superhero. The year is 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis had rocked the world. Marilyn Monroe tragically passed away. The first James Bond movie was released in theatres, and 15-year-old Peter Parker was bit by a radioactive spider and became the Amazing Spider-Man. Each issue of Spider-Man Life Story focuses on a different decade of the character's history, so in order to best break down how Zdarsky builds off and pays tribute to each different era of Spider-Man, we're going to break this video down into 3 sections, each one looking at a 20-year period and how the comic book pays tribute to both the Spider-Man stories of that time and also the real-world context. The first issue, primarily set in 1966, sees Peter face off against the villainous Green Goblin in the backdrop of protests against the Vietnam War, with the young hero unsure as to what the role of Spider-Man and superheroes should be in the conflict. Peter's internal struggles about the ethics of the war are mirrored largely by his supporting cast, with former high school bully Flash Thompson heading off to serve, inspired by Spider-Man's domestic heroics, and Iron Man already arriving in Vietnam to aid American troops, while Harry Osborn ardently protests against the war and Captain America finds himself defending the Vietnamese people from what he sees as oppressive actions by his country. This conflict shapes much of the larger story, both in terms of fragmenting the wider superhero community and Peter's moral dilemma of what parts of his life he chooses to prioritise, and how his responsibility as Spider-Man affects those closest to him. This is best depicted in 2 instances. Firstly, after Peter faces off and defeats the Green Goblin, he anonymously tips off the villain's identity to the NYPD, who raid the Osborn estate and arrest Norman, who, as a result of the fight, suffered head trauma and memory loss, with Peter watching on as the confused Norman is taken into custody, aware of how this act of justice will affect the life of his best friend Harry. Likewise, the end of the first issue sees Peter racing across the city to make it to Grand Central Terminal in time to meet his childhood friends in waving Flash away as he departs to join the military. Peter arrives late though, and is met by an irate Gwen Stacy. Gwen chastises Peter for seemingly blowing Flash off, telling him that he missed the chance to say goodbye and good luck for what could very well be the final time ever, and asking Peter if he even cares about those who he lets closest to him. Peter attempts to respond, but Gwen's eyes instead fixate on his chest, realising that his unbuttoned dress shirt actually reveals his costume underneath it. The pair then share a look, and realise together that their lives will never be the same again. This throughline is carried over into issue 2, which is set 11 years later in 1977, as Peter and Gwen, now married, mourn the loss of their friend Flash Thompson. The Vietnam War continues as the arrival of superheroes leads to ultimate stalemate, as Peter works at the Baxter Building alongside Reed Richards and the reformed Dr. Otto Octavius, whilst Gwen works in genetics for their former teacher, Dr. Miles Warren. This issue focuses on Peter's growth into adulthood, attempting to maintain his marriage, his job and his family, all while continuing to protect New York as the Amazing Spider-Man. The central conflict of this story follows on from the late 1960s as Harry Osborn begins to follow in his father's footsteps and seek revenge on Spider-Man for ruining Norman's life. Harry ambushes Gwen and Dr. Warren at their lab, dressed as the Black Goblin, looking to steal a clone body of Norman that Dr. Warren had been paid to create. Spidey arrives to fend off Harry, but an explosion causes a secret compartment in the lab to be revealed, with Miles Warren having not only made a clone of Norman, but also clones of Gwen and Peter. In a fit of rage, Harry detonates the lab and blows it up, leaving the clones to die. Upon Gwen's insistence though, Peter attempts to race back into the burning building to save the clones, though only his doppelganger actually survived. As Peter returns with his clone body, Dr. Warren begins to freak out, revealing that the Gwen in front of the pair of them was actually the clone, and that the real Gwen had been held in stasis for Dr. Warren to have for himself. This revelation shocks Peter, to say the least. The love of his life, his wife, is gone. And how long had it been that she'd been replaced and he'd been married to a clone? The 70s portion of the story concludes with Peter and Mary Jane Watson, Harry's ex-girlfriend and Peter's childhood best friend, helping set up the surviving clones up with new identities as they depart from New York to start a new life. MJ consoles a disparate Peter, telling him that despite his immeasurable loss, he doesn't have nothing. The year is 1984. Not quite George Orwell's dystopia, the Vietnam War finally came to an end. Miami Vice debuted on television screens as the first Apple Macintosh computer was released, and Mary Jane Watson lies in a hospital bed expecting twins as her husband, Peter Parker, fights alongside an all-star team of superheroes on a strange planet called Battleworld. While the 1960s and 70s were the years that Spider-Man formally introduced himself to the world, many still to this day cite the 80s and 90s as the period where many of his iconic stories came from. This era of the Life Story series certainly pays tribute to all of these, dropping us in the middle of Secret Wars, where now 30-something-year-old Peter fights with his fellow heroes, before discovering the alien symbiote and returning to Earth to be with his wife and newborn twins. By this point in his career, Peter is beginning to noticeably slow down. He's not as quick or as sharp as he once was in his teens, so the enhanced abilities gifted by the alien suit are a welcome surprise to the hero. Much of this issue focuses on Peter's dependence upon the symbiote, and the impact that this has on his relationship with Mary Jane, Aunt May, and his two children. Taking cues from one of the very best Spider-Man stories of the 1980s, the main villain of this period is Kraven the Hunter, who arrives in New York, subdues and buries Spider-Man before taking over his identity, with Kraven explaining his reasoning for hunting Peter is actually out of respect. He's admired Spider-Man for decades, but visibly sees that he's past his best, and now requires putting down. Peter is shot, wounded, and buried by Kraven, a problem compounded by the fact that under a desperate last-ditch plea from Mary Jane, Peter fought Kraven without the alien symbiote. Nevertheless, Peter is rescued and saved by the alien entity, which breaks out of its container at the Parker home and races towards the graveyard where Peter is buried, bonding with him as he emerges from the ground in a fit of animalistic rage, appearing almost like venom. The hunter becomes the hunted then, as Peter tracks Kraven down and prepares to kill him, before Mary Jane arrives with a sonic cannon to rid Peter of the symbiote and prevent him from crossing a line that he would never return from. Peter, understanding the fact that he's losing control of himself within the suit, lets go of Craven and tells MJ to do it, as the sonic waves blast the alien suit off of Peter's body. After this, Peter apologises to MJ and acknowledges his mistakes. He'd been so focused on being Spider-Man to the best of his abilities that he became consumed by the symbiote and neglected his real responsibilities. The next day, however, we see Mary Jane separate from Peter, as she and the two children depart and leave Peter alone in an empty house with Aunt May. Even at Peter's age and at this point in his career, the hardships and the toils of balancing responsibility still remains a core part of the web-slinger's life, and a problem he continues to have to overcome. The devastating loss of the people he loves most as a result of his actions leads Peter to make a crucial life decision in the subsequent years. By 1995, he now oversees a successful company known as Parker Industries, currently fighting off a merger takeover from his rival Tony Stark. The corporate headaches of running such a large company wear thin on the middle-aged hero, especially as he continues to fight crime as Spider-Man. While out doing so, Peter is attacked and kidnapped by Dr. Octavius, where he wakes up in a mysterious lab to see Harry Osborn, his former friend who disappeared after the clone saga of the 1970s, standing alongside his clone Ben, as Doc Ock reveals to the two that Ben Parker wasn't actually the clone at all, and much like what had happened to Gwen, Peter was actually the clone created by Dr. Miles Warren. A fight breaks out between the four following this revelation, with Harry trying to calm the situation down before he's accidentally impaled by one of Octavius's metal arms. Ben chases after a fleeing Otto, while Peter tends and cares for his dying best friend, with Harry passing away in his arms as the two reconcile. Following this, the next day, Ben and Peter meet up and Peter gives Ben his life back, handing him everything from Peter's passwords, his keys, his company, and even the role of Spider-Man, telling Ben that he's returning the life that he had stolen from him, with Peter admitting that he's tired of living this life after 20 years, with Ben thanking Peter and in return handing him a homemade Spider-Man mask that Ben had kept with him for all this time, because neither one of them can resist responsibility. With Peter now free of his burdens, he plans to leave New York behind and travel to Portland, Oregon, but not before visiting an old foe in the form of Norman Osborn, where Peter reveals that he knew Norman orchestrated this entire situation, and that he knows that Ben is actually the clone, with Norman vengeful for Peter having him jailed 30 years ago, before Peter tells him that Harry was killed. Norman lashes out in response to this, blaming Peter, but as he does so, he suffers a fatal heart attack, dying in Peter's arms, with his very last words being, "I hate you." With all of the skeletons in Peter's closet now finally removed, he arrives outside a large house in the Portland suburbs, where he's greeted by two happy children, Benjamin and Claire. Peter begins to cry as he embraces his children for the first time in so long, before looking up at the doorway to see Mary Jane Watson stood waiting for him. Finally, after all this time, Peter Parker is home. The year is 2006. The United States war on terror continues throughout the Middle East. Nintendo released their highly anticipated Wii console, Daniel Powder's Bad Day topped the music charts, and Spider-Man was tragically killed, live on television. The Parker family watch in horror as the web-slinger is killed by the villain Morlun. Of course, it was Ben under the suit, but it's this shocking incident that forces the now 59-year-old hero back into action. We're under the assumption at this point that Peter had never worn the suit following passing the mantle over to his clone Ben 11 years prior, but Claire, Peter's daughter, confronts him over television footage of a mysterious masked man rescuing people caught in the rubble of the September 11 attacks, proving, much like he and Ben said years earlier, the two of them could never quite escape responsibility. Peter returns to New York, where he's confronted by Tony Stark, reminding Peter that he never signed the Superhero Registration Act. A fight breaks out between Peter and Tony's team of heroes before he's rescued by Captain America and his band of unregistered superheroes. Cap and Peter defeat Tony and reconnect like two old veterans of a long superhero war, with Peter telling Cap that it's time to do what old men should, leave the world a better place. This notion is carried further into the final decade of the story, as Peter attempts to grapple with his legacy and the world that he chooses to leave behind. Now over 70 years old, Peter suffers from a recurring nightmare, each night visualising the events leading up to Uncle Ben's death and how he failed to stop the killer when he had the chance. In the year 2019, the world is embroiled in a bitter war between heroes and villains, with Peter alongside his apprentice Miles Morales on an important mission to prevent the world's doomsday. Peter and Miles jet off to an abandoned Stark space station, searching for a doomsday pulse to destroy the lab and prevent its use in the war, when the two of them are attacked by Venom, now bonded with Kraven the Hunter, with the two of them seeking revenge after what Peter did to them both in the 1980s. As the two heroes fight the monster off, Peter uses a sonic boom to blow the symbiote off of Kraven's body, revealing nothing but a skeleton behind. Peter tells Miles that all my enemies are dead, before Miles suddenly attacks Peter and reveals himself to actually be Dr. Otto Octavius, having switched bodies with Peter's new student, proclaiming himself to be the superior Spider-Man. The two longtime foes clash heads and are taken to the Mindscape, where Doc Ock forces Peter to fight the many demons of his past. Peter subdues Octavius with the memory of Aunt May, Otto's former love and their shared loss, before taking Miles' body and placing it in a parachute pod, and instructing Otto to return to Earth and give the young hero back his life. As the space station begins to self-destruct, Peter webs pieces of it together as he searches for the Doomsday Pulse. Activating it, Peter realises he's now on a suicide mission, unable to make it out of the blast radius in time. Closing his eyes and thinking back to his youth, reliving his life story as he counts the seconds down to his inevitable demise. Peter makes peace with his past, whispers his final words, "Mary Jane Watson, you're my jackpot," and lets go as the ship explodes. Back on Earth, Miles, now back in his own body, meets with Mary Jane following Peter's funeral, with MJ presenting the young hero with Peter's original costume from the 1960s, giving him her blessing to continue on his legacy as the new Amazing Spider-Man. We then witness Peter's recurring dream once again, reliving the night of Uncle Ben's death, except this time it's Miles under the suit who catches the criminal. As Peter's life comes to a close, he watches his legacy unfold, with his successes and failures there for the next generation to learn from, and as one life story ends, another begins. The question of legacy and the choices that someone makes throughout their life is at the core of what Spider-Man life story is. Throughout these 6 issues, Zdarsky and Bagley attempt to pay tribute to as many classic Spider-Man stories as possible, creating a linear timeline of the hero's life and assessing what would become of Peter if he had lived through these events in real time, and how his heroics would have shaped the world around him. What I think this comic does best above all else is translate the ideals and the message at the heart of Spider-Man as a character, and what's made him such a beloved and enduring figure throughout the many years of his existence. We watch as Peter grows from an uncertain teenager trying to find his place in the world, to an elderly, seasoned hero giving his life to save the world and ensuring that it has a future. Peter's final act is the ultimate personification of responsibility, and the way that Zdarsky sends Peter off into the sunset feels like an ultimate tribute to a character whose message and meaning will live on forever. For a character that resonates with his readers so personally, Life Story manages to take this and tell a deeply emotional story of a young hero growing up, making mistakes, and trying to leave behind a legacy, issues that all of us will grapple with throughout our own lives. The comic manages to give each generation of Spidey fans a version of the character that feels so deeply connected and relatable to them, and at its heart, tells nothing short of a brilliant love letter to the very things that made us all fall in love and connect with Spider-Man to begin with. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. Now, if you did, please make sure to leave a like on the video and leave a comment down below as well. Let me know your thoughts on everything we talked about in today's video. I can't wait to hear what you have to say as always. If you're new to the channel, please consider hitting the subscribe button and the notify bell, and there should be some other videos on screen right now that you might also enjoy if you enjoyed this one. If you want to support the channel and help me make more videos, you can do so over at patreon.com/Owen Likes Comics. And if you want some more of me, you can follow me on Twitter, just at Owen Likes Comics. That's all for this video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time. So until then, take care and keep reading.